just thinking about you. We'd already scheduled the interview, and I was reading Pete Hegseth's new book on Battle for the American Mind, and he talked in there about the importance of right to work in order to break up these unions, these public unions, that especially the teacher unions that have so infiltrated the communists, cultural Marxists have so infiltrated them, and they've got such a stranglehold on the education system. But it was interesting to me that he brought it back to right to work and the effort that you're doing and why that's so important. So some people don't think about that what you're doing is free market, right to work, battle these unions, but it actually affects our education system and everything else as well. It's a much bigger topic than what we sometimes see it as.
Yeah, indeed. And the news is really good on that front, because I think if there was a silver lining coming out of COVID, it was the fact that parents and taxpayers and others got a real peek at what was going on in the government school system. And Rick, the power of the unions in our government school system is a result of legislative action. It's a result of state legislatures and school boards and city councils and county commissions that give this private organization, i.e. a labor union, the monopoly voice in the marketplace when it comes to public education. And so this union power and the ability to reform the educational system in America run head-on in a head-on collision, because when you think about Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and Becky Pringle, the president of the National Education Association, and you just do a real shallow dive on the views that they have about what our school system should be or shouldn't be, and it's no surprise that we find out that there's less about reading, writing, and arithmetic and more about social engineering and political work and cultural degradation. It's all right there for people to see, and we've seen it. And now we're talking about it, and hopefully we're going to see some dramatic change.
Well, and let me ask you, just in terms of big labor's money in the elections for 2022. I mean, obviously for them, it's all or none. I mean, they really need the Democrats to maintain control, so they're going all in a lot of these races out there. Do you think they still have the level of influence that they had in the past? I mean, do you think they're going to be able to pull out some of these races? I know this is off topic from what we're supposed to be talking about today, but you're so plugged into this. I was just curious what you were thinking on that.
Well, the idea about their power is one thing. The idea about their money, there's no question they're going to have the money. I mean, when you have a government thumb on the scale that allows you to force people to pay dues or fees in order to work, that's a pretty good business model. And so from the private sector perspective, they're going to have more money than they've ever had to spend on politics, and they're going to spend it.
Drill down on that real quick so people understand. They literally have a forced donation for these employees, and it's not a couple of $1 million. It's hundreds of millions of dollars. And I mean, just the teacher unions of California alone get hundreds of millions of dollars like that to play in the campaigns with. It's huge.
Yeah, that's right. So let's start with the private sector. In the private sector, the federal government allows union officials to force workers to associate with them, and they also allow union officials to force workers to pay them for taking away their rights of association. It's a really amazing thing when you look at it from a very specific perspective. So in 23 states that don't have right to work laws today, workers would lose their jobs if they don't pay money to a private organization, i.e. a labor union. That money goes into a general treasury account. And while union officials will say that they don't use it for politics, that's absolutely ridiculous, because they use it for things that are very, very political, like voter registration drives, get out the vote drives, mobilization drives, and, so-called union paid volunteers going out and walking streets and walking neighborhoods and knocking on doors and putting out literature and printing signs and all that stuff. That's all part of the union's program. At the public sector, for the teachers unions and government unions, it's a little bit different, Rick. We've talked about this before, but it's important to talk about it again. In 2018, we won a U.S. Supreme Court case called Janus v. AFSCME. And that case, on behalf of a single employee in the state of Illinois who stood up and said stop when the union said that he had to pay them fees in order to work for the state of Illinois, the United States Supreme Court, the majority decision, said that no government employee anywhere in America can be forced to pay anything to a union in order to work for their government, because that everything that government unions do, teachers unions and public sector unions do, is political by nature. They're redressing government. And so that money's being used to influence politics. And so it's no surprise that the unions, not only do they spend money in the hundreds of millions, Rick, they spend millions in the billions. And I know billions is not a lot of money anymore, according to, the general consensus of what our government does, quote, right, for us or to us, depending on how you look at it. But it literally is probably the biggest amount that's spent in politics. And so when your power is a derivative of government action, you got to be in politics, and that's where the unions are. Instead of going out and selling a product to workers and encouraging them to join voluntarily, they have to play politics because their power is resident and part of and a derivative of government action. That's why they play politics so hard. That's why they're involved, and that's why we have to be involved fighting back against it.
Catch us up on even that fight individually in individual states. You guys have been doing this a long time. You've won big battles, and managed to get right to work states. I think, what are we at, like 28 or 27, something like that.
Yeah.
And now they want to try to override that with federal law. Tell us what they're doing with this.
Yeah, Rick, we've passed 5 new right to work laws in the last 10 years. It's been a really good run, and the more we talk about individual freedom and individual liberty in the workplace, the more people respond. Yeah, but the union officials and the politicians that are recipients of that money we just talked about don't like the fact that we're making progress. They don't want
you turning off that spigot, man. They like all that money coming to them. Yeah.
Indeed they do. And so they've got a plan, a bill that's already passed the House of Representatives. It passed last year. And, Rick, you won't be surprised by this. It passed with no committee hearings, no testimony. It just ran right to the floor. And the first thing this bill, it's called the PRO Act, the Protecting Right to Organize Act, which is misnamed, and that's a deeper dive into labor policy. But there is no prohibitions in federal law about people organizing unions. That's a fact. And no matter what union officials say or anyone else says or any politician says, workers who want to organize and do it by the regulations that have been established for 80-plus years, they can unionize and organize unions. So there's nothing that stops them from doing that. What they do want to do, though, Rick, and one of the centerpieces of that bill is to repeal all 27 right-to-work laws. And you say, well, how can the federal legislature repeal state right-to-work laws that have been passed in state legislatures across the country over the last 50, 60 years, 5, as I mentioned, in the last 10 years? Well, they can do it because the ability for a state to pass a right-to-work law is actually a privilege granted by the United States Congress back in 1947 under a bill that passed called the Taft-Hartley Act. You know, from 1935 to 1947, labor unions grew dramatically because they went to government, and Franklin Roosevelt and his large majorities in Congress gave them this compulsory forced unionism power. And from 1937, when the Supreme Court upheld it as constitutional, till 1947, the unions grew like crazy, and they have this power. And Congress came back in after 1946, and they said, we went too far, we need to reform this, and they allowed states the privilege, the opportunity to pass right-to-work laws, which outlaw the forced payment of dues or fees that an employee would have to pay or lose their job. So
essentially gave the final decision back to the states instead of it being a one-size-fits-all from Washington.
Well, that's right. They didn't give the final decision to the states, but they gave the decision to states. What they're trying to do now is take back that decision and say, you know what, we're going to reimpose federal jurisdiction over state labor policy in every aspect, including the ability to enforce this forced dues provision that exists in federal law today. I mean, in California, for example, there is no state statute that says private sector workers have to pay union dues in order to work. That is power that comes from the federal government. So in California, they just let the federal jurisdiction apply, and they can write these union security agreements that say you must pay us or you will lose your job. In a right-to-work state, they can't write that provision into a contract. They can't have union security forced dues clauses in contracts because the state has said, we'll take the privilege you gave us and we'll pass right-to-work laws. So this bill that's pending in the Senate with 47 co-sponsors now would basically eliminate the ability for states to have it, and it would repeal all the 27 right-to-work laws that are in place today across the country.
Oh, that's huge. Okay, so I'm always wanting to learn more about the history and the constitutional provisions and all that. So I got to ask you, I mean, I read the Constitution all the time. There is no labor provision anywhere in the Constitution. There's no federal I know they use the Commerce Clause for it, but, I mean, wouldn't they rather make these decisions at the state level to local level and not have this massive bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. making all these decisions? This bill would be the opposite of that. It's the opposite of federalism. It's consolidating power at the federal level again.
That's right, and they had that debate back in 1933, Rick, when Roosevelt tried to pass the original National Recovery Act, the NRA, National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. It passed through the House, passed through the Senate. Roosevelt signed it, and it went up to the Supreme Court, and it was ruled unconstitutional for the very reasons you're articulating. You know, violation of the 10th Amendment, the 9th Amendment, those types of things. And I know you guys are much greater students and better students of the Constitution than I am. But let's just go over to the First Amendment of the Constitution that says, you know, the right to associate, the right to speech. the right to speech and the right to associate come with a corollary logically, or they can't exist. And that corollary is the right not to associate,
yes.
the right not to speak. And so it's a very basic First Amendment argument when we talk about, this forced association that's written into law. So Roosevelt gets overruled by the Supreme Court. He gets mad. He sends a letter over to Chief Justice Frankfurter and says, you guys are getting pretty old over there and you're getting long in the tooth. And so we think we probably need to add an associate justice to any current justice who's over 70 years old and remains on the court over the next 6 months. So that would have meant that the Supreme Court would have gone to 15. And, Rick, as you know, there is no articulated number for the Supreme Court in Article 3 of the Constitution. It simply says there will be a court. So from time to time, the size of the court has changed. So Roosevelt threatens Chief Justice Frankfurter. And back then we had we had the Three Musketeers and we had the Four Horsemen, and then we had Chief Justice Frankfurter and Owen Roberts were the two kind of swing justices. And all of a sudden, when they reintroduced basically the same bill in 1935, it passes, the president signs it, it goes up to the Supreme Court, and Rick, all of a sudden, the two justices that were against it previously are now for it, and it gets upheld in a case called Jones and Laughlin Steel, and it becomes federal law. And so the arguments that were made against it in 1933 were the same that they made against it in 1937, but the court, because of Roosevelt's pressure and the threat to pack the court, the switch in time saved 9. And this is one of those cases where they switched. And I think unemployment insurance and Social Security or something
minimum
else.
Wage.
Minimum wage, exactly. You got it.
Yeah.
That's right. I think it was those 4 issues that caused this switch in time, and it allowed Roosevelt to push the whole New Deal through back during that period, which we know has been a disaster for federalism and for state